They said a woman couldn't hold land by herself on the high plains. They were wrong, but loneliness nearly proved them right. This is the story of Evelyn Carter and the desolate beauty of the Double Bar Ranch. Evelyn stood on her porch as the sun bled out behind the hills, staining the sky the color of old rust. The prairie wind combed through the tall grass, whispering the same question it asked every single night. "How much longer can you do this alone?" She never answered. 3 years had passed since her husband, Thomas Carter, rode out with a cattle drive and never came home. There was no grave, no body, just a blood-stained saddle found weeks later near Red Rock Pass. Folks in town called her a widow, but that word felt too final. Evelyn lived somewhere between Hope and mourning, a place far lonelier than either. The ranch had become her entire world. Before dawn, she fed the horses and mucked out the stalls. By mid-morning, she was out fixing fences or driving off coyotes that strayed too close to the herd. At night, she counted stars instead of sheep, sleeping with a rifle propped against her bed. The land tested her daily, and so did the men who circled it like buzzards. Bankers with foreclosures in their eyes, neighboring ranchers who saw weakness, and quiet predators who believed a woman's claim was only temporary. Yet, she stayed. Because this land was more than just dirt and grass. It was the last place Thomas's laughter still felt warm, the last place his memory felt alive. That evening, as the warm light from her lantern spilled across the porch, her horse suddenly snorted from the corral. A sound of alarm. Then came another sound, hoofbeats. Slow, deliberate, not the familiar rhythm of a friend or neighbor. Evelyn's hand found the rifle resting against the wall before her thoughts even caught up. A single rider emerged from the deepening dark, his coat long and black, his hat pulled low, casting his face in shadow. His horse bore the marks of a long, hard journey, foam at its mouth, legs trembling with exhaustion. The man stopped just short of the gate, raised both hands in a gesture of peace, and called out in a voice as rough as gravel, "Ma'am, I don't want any trouble." Every instinct screamed at Evelyn to send him away, to protect the fragile peace she had fought so hard to maintain. But instinct had never fed cattle or buried the dead. It had never helped her hold this land against the world. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steady, her aim unwavering. The rider slowly dismounted. As he stepped into the faint glow of the lantern, the light caught his face, scarred, weather-beaten, with eyes that carried the kind of weight no man earns honestly. He swallowed hard, then spoke words she hadn't heard spoken aloud in years. "I'm here about Thomas Carter." The rifle nearly slipped from her hands. Her breath caught in her throat, sharp and painful. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "You don't get to say that name," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of grief and rage. "Not if you rode all this way just to sell me lies." The man shook his head, a gesture of solemn denial. "I ain't selling anything, ma'am. I'm paying a debt." He reached inside his coat. Evelyn's grip tightened on the rifle, her heart hammering against her ribs. But instead of a gun, he pulled out a small leather pouch. He set it carefully on the fence rail. It clinked softly, the sound of coins cutting through the night's silence. "My name is Caleb Rourke," he said. "I'm an outlaw if you believe the posters. Something worse, if you believe the stories." "I believe what I see," Evelyn replied, her voice cold as steel. "And I see a man who should leave before I decide not to miss." Caleb met her gaze without flinching. His eyes held no fear, only a deep, unsettling wariness. Thomas saved my life. The wind seemed to stop. The crickets fell silent. Even the stars seemed to hold their breath. He found me bleeding out in a ravine after a robbery went bad. He could have turned me in for the bounty. Could have finished me off right there. Instead, he gave me water. And his horse. Evelyn felt her knees weaken, the strength draining out of her. You're lying. The words were a desperate plea. I wish I was, Caleb said, his voice quiet, filled with a regret so profound it felt tangible. I rode that horse hard, trying to get away. When I finally turned back to help him, it was too late. Men were coming. The kind that don't leave witnesses behind. Silence pressed in around them, thick and merciless, heavy with the weight of unspoken tragedy. Why are you here now? Evelyn asked, her voice barely holding together the question she had asked the empty prairie for 3 long years. Because I ran from what I owed, he answered, his gaze dropping to the dirt. And the longer I ran, the heavier that debt got. He gestured toward the pouch of coins on the fence. That's not enough. It'll never be enough to repay him. But I can give you something else. Evelyn laughed once, a sound that was bitter and hollow, echoing the emptiness inside her. I don't need charity from a killer. Caleb nodded slowly, as if he expected nothing less. I don't blame you. He turned to leave, his boots crunching on the gravel, a man ready to walk back into the darkness he came from. But then, she stopped him. You said you're paying a debt, she called out, her voice stronger now, laced with a new, dangerous resolve. Debts don't end with coins. Caleb looked back over his shoulder, his eyes dark and haunted in the lantern light. No, ma'am, he said. They end with blood. Before she could ask what he meant, a distant gunshot cracked through the night, followed by another, closer this time. Caleb's hand flew to the revolver at his hip, his entire body tensing like a coiled spring. They found me, he said, his voice a low growl, and now they've found you. As the silhouettes of riders crested the far ridge, dark shapes against the starlit sky, Evelyn realized the truth. Her quiet life, her lonely sanctuary, had just become a battleground. And the outlaw standing on her porch, a ghost from her husband's past, might be the only thing standing between her and her own grave. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like and subscribe for more tales from the frontier. The first bullet cracked against the fence post, splintering wood just inches from Evelyn's shoulder. Caleb's voice was a sharp bark, not of an outlaw, but of a man who'd seen too many nights like this. Inside. Now, Evelyn didn't waste a second arguing. She snatched the lantern, spun, and sprinted for the house as another shot tore through the darkness. The first bullet cracked against the fence post, splintering wood just inches from Evelyn's shoulder. Caleb's voice was a sharp bark, not of an outlaw, but of a man who'd seen too many nights like this. Inside. Now, Evelyn didn't waste a second arguing. She snatched the lantern, spun, and sprinted for the house as another shot tore through the darkness. Caleb vaulted the fence in one fluid motion, firing once toward the ridge, a warning shot to keep the riders honest. The sound echoed across the plains, a grim tolling bell. They burst into the cabin together, slamming the door just as lead punched into the outer wall, shaking dust from the rafters. How many? Evelyn asked, her hands already moving, loading her rifle with practiced skill. 4, maybe 5, Caleb replied, already securing the room. He shoved a heavy table against the door, kicking a chair beneath the handle for good measure. "They ain't law," he said grimly. "Bounty hunters or worse. Worse than bounty hunters," she retorted, her voice tight. Caleb met her gaze, his eyes dark. "Men who don't care who gets hurt, as long as I don't leave breathing." Just then, another bullet shattered the window. Glass rained down like icy tears. Evelyn ducked, her heart hammering not with fear, but with a sharper feeling, resolve. They began a deadly dance, circling the small cabin, firing in turns, counting shots, listening to the thud of hoofbeats and the muffled curses from the dark. Suddenly, a horse screamed, then thundered off into the night, riderless. Just then, another bullet shattered the window. Glass rained down like icy tears. Evelyn ducked, her heart hammering not with fear, but with a sharper feeling, resolve. They began a deadly dance, circling the small cabin, firing in turns, counting shots, listening to the thud of hoofbeats and the muffled curses from the dark. Suddenly, a horse screamed, then thundered off into the night, riderless. Caleb lowered his revolver, but didn't holster it. "They'll be back at first light," he said, his voice low. "With more men." Evelyn leaned against the wall, her breath shaky but her will firm. "Then you should leave. Take them away from here." "I won't," he replied flatly. She stared at him, a spark of anger in her eyes. Just then, another bullet shattered the window. Glass rained down like icy tears. Evelyn ducked, her heart hammering not with fear, but with a sharper feeling, resolve. They began a deadly dance, circling the small cabin, firing in turns, counting shots, listening to the thud of hoofbeats and the muffled curses from the dark. Suddenly, a horse screamed, then thundered off into the night, riderless. Caleb shouted her name, dragging her behind the water trough as bullets chewed into the wood and earth around them. "Stay down," he ordered. Blood was already soaking her sleeve. "Finish it," she said through clenched teeth. "For Thomas." Caleb looked at Hurley, and something shifted in his eyes. He rose, stepping out from cover, into the open, a man done running. Caleb shouted her name, dragging her behind the water trough as bullets chewed into the wood and earth around them. "Stay down," he ordered. Blood was already soaking her sleeve. "Finish it," she said through clenched teeth. "For Thomas." Caleb looked at Hurley, and something shifted in his eyes. He rose, stepping out from cover, into the open, a man done running. Caleb shouted her name, dragging her behind the water trough as bullets chewed into the wood and earth around them. "Stay down," he ordered. Blood was already soaking her sleeve. "Finish it," she said through clenched teeth. "For Thomas." Caleb looked at Hurley, and something shifted in his eyes. He rose, stepping out from cover, into the open, a man done running. Caleb shouted her name, dragging her behind the water trough as bullets chewed into the wood and earth around them. "Stay down," he ordered. Blood was already soaking her sleeve. "Finish it," she said through clenched teeth. "For Thomas." Caleb looked at Hurley, and something shifted in his eyes. He rose, stepping out from cover, into the open, a man done running. And then, from the ridge behind them, a sound no one expected, a whistle, sharp and clear. Then another, followed by the unmistakable, ground-shaking thunder of approaching hooves. Caleb's eyes widened as dust swallowed the horizon. Whatever was coming, it was coming fast, and it would decide everything. And then, from the ridge behind them, a sound no one expected, a whistle, sharp and clear. Then another, followed by the unmistakable, ground-shaking thunder of approaching hooves. Caleb's eyes widened as dust swallowed the horizon. Whatever was coming, it was coming fast, and it would decide everything. And then, from the ridge behind them, a sound no one expected, a whistle, sharp and clear. Then another, followed by the unmistakable, ground-shaking thunder of approaching hooves. Caleb's eyes widened as dust swallowed the horizon. Whatever was coming, it was coming fast, and it would decide everything. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this part of the story, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the thrilling conclusion. See you in the next one. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this part of the story, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the thrilling conclusion. See you in the next one. The riders turned as one. From the ridge poured a line of men on horsebacks. Steady, deliberate. It wasn't a mob. It wasn't chaos. It was lawmen. At their center rode an older sheriff with iron-gray hair and a badge dulled by years of honest wear. The bounty hunters cursed under their breath, scattering like startled crows. Caleb breathed out a name, a mix of shock and relief. Sheriff Mason. I figured you were done chasing ghosts. Sheriff Mason reined in his horse. Evelyn pushed herself upright, the sharp sting of her wounded arm a distant sensation. Blood dripped from her sleeve, staining the dry ground. You knew, she called out, her voice raw with disbelief. Evelyn pushed herself upright, the sharp sting of her wounded arm a distant sensation. Blood dripped from her sleeve, staining the dry ground. You knew, she called out, her voice raw with disbelief and a flicker of hope. Mason gave a single, solemn nod. Thomas rode into my office 3 years ago. Said he'd seen something he couldn't unsee. Those men, he gestured with his chin toward the fleeing bounty hunters, were running guns and stealing land, titles, killing anyone who got in their way. He followed them all the way to Red Rock Pass. Evelyn's voice broke, the question tearing from her throat. Why didn't you bring him home? Because he asked me not to, Mason replied, his gaze softening for a moment. He said if they thought he was dead, you might live. A heavy silence swept across the ranch, deeper than any gunshot. It was a silence filled with 3 years of unanswered questions, of grief and mistaken blame. The bounty hunters, realizing their predicament, tried to make a break for it. They didn't make it far. Shots rang out, not wild, not angry, just final, precise and efficient. The dust settled around them, and horses fled, riderless, into the vast emptiness of the plains. Caleb stood still, his revolver hanging loosely at his side, its purpose now fulfilled. He looked at the sheriff, his posture no longer that of a hunted man. Sheriff, he said quietly, I won't run. I never should have. Mason studied him for a long moment, taking in the scene. Caleb standing guard, Evelyn wounded but alive. You saved my men more than once these past few months, the sheriff stated, leaving trails for us, warnings. You helped us corner them right here. Caleb's eyes flicked to Evelyn, his expression unreadable. I owed her. Mason nodded, a flicker of understanding in his weathered eyes. And debts matter. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn at the creases. He unfolded it slowly. Charges against Caleb Rourke, hereby dismissed, in recognition of cooperation and lives saved. Caleb exhaled, a long, ragged breath, like a man who's just broken the surface after being held under deep water for too long. At that moment, Evelyn swayed, the adrenaline finally leaving her. Before she could fall, Caleb was there, catching her, his arm a steady presence around her. The days that followed passed slow and gentle, a stark contrast to the violence that had shattered their lives. Evelyn healed beneath soft skies and quieter nights. The ranch, which had stood as a symbol of her grief, began to feel like home again. The fences were mended, the cattle were calm. Sheriff Mason and his men rode away, leaving behind a hard-won peace and truths that had been buried for far too long. One evening, as the sun melted like liquid gold across the plains, Caleb stood at the edge of the yard, his hat held in his hands. "I'll be going," he said, his voice low. He couldn't quite meet her eyes. "This land deserves clean air." Evelyn looked at him. Truly looked at the man who had brought death to her door end, then stayed to protect her life. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the weight of his past. "Thomas believed people could change," she said softly. "That's why he gave you his horse." Caleb swallowed hard, the simple truth of her words hitting him with unexpected force. "I don't know who I am without running," he admitted, the confession raw and honest. "Then stay," she replied, her voice firm but kind. "Stay long enough to learn." The wind whispered through the tall grass, a sound like a blessing, carrying away the echoes of gunfire and sorrow. Months later, the Double Bar Ranch was thriving again. Laughter had returned, quiet at first, then growing more real, more frequent. It filled the spaces that silence had once owned. Caleb worked from dawn until dusk, his hands becoming calloused from mending what was broken, earning every step he took on that land. He was no longer running from his past, but building a future, one day at a time. One night, as they sat on the porch, Evelyn placed the old pocket watch in his hand. It was cool and heavy. "Time doesn't forgive," she said, her gaze meeting his. "But it allows for new beginnings, for second chances." Caleb closed his fingers around it, the polished metal warm against his skin. His eyes shone in the fading light, reflecting a future he never thought he'd have. At sunset, two figures stood on that porch, no longer alone, no longer haunted by ghosts. The vast prairie stretched wide and forgiving before them. And somewhere, beyond the distant horizon, a good man could finally rest, knowing the blood he spilled had bought not death, but a future. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more tales from the Old West. We'll see you in the next one.